Harold Hank Brody, a 72-year-old decorated combat veteran, faces a nightmare at the TSA checkpoint. His advanced prosthetic leg, a marvel of modern engineering and a symbol of his sacrifice, becomes a target of suspicion. Agent Mercer, dismissive and disrespectful, demands its public removal, despite medical risks and Hank's pleas for dignity. As humiliation mounts, Hank, pushed to his limit, makes a desperate call to a Special Department of Defense hotline. The response is swift. A code red protocol is declared for veteran dignity violation, and he's told not to comply. The airport falls eerily silent as military personnel approach, leaving everyone wondering what drastic measures are about to unfold. Thank you for engaging with this powerful story. If it moved you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I share impactful narratives that highlight dignity and service, bringing often unnoticed stories to light. Your support makes a difference. Let's choose respect together. Sir, are you hiding something in that prosthetic? The voice rang out, sharp and unrelenting, loud enough to catch the attention of half the terminal. The TSA agent's eyes were narrowed, fixed with suspicion on the sleek, high-tech leg of an elderly man who stood before him, unshaken. Harold Hank Brody, 72 years old, squared his shoulders and held his ground with the quiet strength of someone long accustomed to scrutiny. "It's a microprocessor-controlled limb," he replied, his tone steady, betraying none of the weariness in his bones. The agent gave a mocking smirk. "Rules are rules, hero. Take it off or you're not flying." Hank didn't flinch, but there was a flicker behind his eyes, an echo of past indignities endured with gritted teeth and locked jaw. A few minutes later, he sat alone in a narrow, brightly lit screening room, clutching the prosthetic that had cost him so much more than flesh. Stripped of dignity in a space no wider than a supply closet, he said nothing. But the silence that had once been a companion in combat now pressed in, heavier than before. Then something shifted. The terminal outside, once buzzing with casual conversations and rolling luggage, dropped into eerie stillness. Footsteps approached, measured, deliberate. Then a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "This is Secretary of Defense General Beckett. Agent Mercer, report to me immediately." The atmosphere changed in an instant. Uniformed personnel straightened, eyes turned, and within moments what unfolded stunned not just the airport but would soon flood headlines across the country. Despite the humiliation, Hank Brody sat with the composed air of a man who had walked through fire and come out forged by it. He still looked every bit the soldier, with an upright bearing honed by decades of discipline. His cropped silver hair framed a face lined by time, not defeat. Age had settled in his joints, yes, but his eyes stayed sharp, his chin lifted, and his pride untouched. He had fought in 2 wars, Vietnam, when he was barely out of high school, barely a man. Then Iraq, long after most had hung up their uniforms. Recalled as a seasoned, non-commissioned officer, he had returned to the battlefield not to fight, but to teach. He trained a new generation of soldiers in counterinsurgency tactics, bridging decades of experience with modern warfare. The scars of those conflicts were etched into him, but none so plainly as the advanced prosthetic that had replaced his lower left leg. It wasn't just a medical device. It was a symbol of survival, sacrifice, and relentless will. Matte black, sleek, and engineered with cutting-edge microprocessors, embedded sensors, and adaptive terrain software, it was a marvel. It allowed Hank to walk upright without assistance. He could even climb stairs, though the rhythm was different now, more deliberate, less spontaneous. He didn't flaunt the limb, nor did he try to conceal it. It was his, just as much as his uniform had once been. Just like his service medals and every memory, sharp or bitter, that accompanied them. And he treated it with the same quiet reverence, not for the machine, but for what it stood for. That morning had begun in Flagstaff, Arizona. Before dawn broke across the peaks, Hank had brewed a strong cup of black coffee, sipping slowly while the house remained quiet. He methodically packed his carry-on, a fresh change of clothes, his medication, and a manila folder containing the speech he'd prepared for Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. He was heading there to speak, not for glory, not for applause, but to share a truth that others like him carried daily. His speech centered on living with combat-related injuries and how evolving prosthetics were helping veterans regain their autonomy and purpose. But for Hank, it meant more than delivering prepared words at a podium. It was a homecoming. The audience would include the very people who'd rebuilt him, surgeons who'd shaped the socket, therapists who'd retrained his balance, engineers who'd fine-tuned the limb to respond like muscle. Many of them he hadn't seen in more than 10 years. This wasn't just a lecture. It was a silent reunion between fragments of a long recovery, now finally gathered in one place. He hadn't been chosen to speak because he was the most decorated. Far from it. He was chosen because he represented something harder to define: perseverance. The man who never stopped pushing forward through surgeries, grueling physical therapy, and the quiet, often overlooked labor of learning to walk on something not made of flesh or blood, but of algorithms and carbon fiber. He dressed with intention that day. Slacks tailored to sit comfortably over the prosthetic, a crisp light blue shirt, and his navy blazer. On its lapel, the tiny American flag pin he reserved for days that mattered. No need for showiness. His presence spoke for itself. By the time Hank arrived at the airport, he was collected and composed. He had rehearsed his words, prepared for the day ahead, and as always, anticipated the usual screening ritual. Flagstaff's airport wasn't large, but that morning, like most, it buzzed with energy. Families herding toddlers, business people juggling calls, retirees shuffling through lines with practiced ease. Hank blended into it all, moving with practiced patience. He was used to security procedures by now. He had passed through dozens of checkpoints since losing his leg. He had learned the formula: stay calm, answer questions, expect extra screening. It wasn't pleasant, but it was part of the routine. Still, something about this time was different. As he passed through the body scanner, a soft beep broke the white noise of the terminal. A red flash appeared on the monitor. Hank stopped, unfazed. He knew the drill. The signal had likely come from the prosthetic. He turned to face the officer, a young man in his mid-20s, uniform crisp, authority still new to his voice. Hank stood steady, waiting for the next step. He didn't expect courtesy, but he hadn't expected suspicion either. What followed would ripple far beyond the walls of that terminal. His hair was cropped so sharply it might as well have been part of his uniform. The name tag stitched to his chest read, "Mercer." "Sir," the agent said as he took 2 quick, authoritative strides forward, "I'm going to need to perform a pat-down around your lower leg." His tone wasn't overtly rude, but it was unnecessarily loud, deliberately loud, and it turned a few heads among the nearby travelers. Some slowed their steps, others glanced over with idle curiosity. "No problem," Hank replied evenly. His voice was smooth, calm, practiced. "It's a microprocessor-controlled prosthetic. I declared it when I checked in, and it's listed with my boarding pass. I have documentation too, if needed." Hank reached calmly into his bag and held out a folded paper, but Agent Mercer didn't so much as glance at it. Instead, his eyes flicked down to Hank's leg, narrowing with suspicion. "Microprocessor-controlled, huh?" Mercer repeated, like Hank had invented the term on the spot. His tone was sharp now, distrustful. "I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening." Hank didn't argue. He nodded once, took up his carry-on, and followed Mercer to a secondary screening area a few feet away from the main security lane. Travelers began lining up behind him, some stealing glances, others pretending not to look at all. Hank had grown familiar with the sideways stares over the years. Curiosity, pity, sometimes admiration, sometimes revulsion. He'd seen it all, but then Mercer spoke again, and this time his voice held a bite that hadn't been there before. "We'll need you to remove it for separate X-ray screening." The words floated there, dense and heavy. Hank blinked. "Remove it, what?" he asked, still keeping his tone even. "Officer, this isn't a strap-on. It's precision-fitted. Taking it off here isn't just medically risky, it's humiliating." Mercer crossed his arms, posture firm and eyes challenging. "Rules are rules, hero. Prosthetic comes off or you don't fly." That word, hero, didn't land with praise. It landed like a slap, dipped in sarcasm, thrown as an accusation. A challenge, a dismissal. Hank felt the hit. I've flown through more airports than I can count, he said, his voice low now, almost a murmur meant just for Mercer. I've always complied with screenings. No complaints. This isn't how TSA usually handles this. Mercer gave a small, joyless smirk. Well, I'm not typical. You're hiding something in that thing, he added, nodding toward the prosthetic. You'd be amazed what people try to sneak through. Hank's jaw clenched. Around them, the watching had stopped being subtle. A mother nearby gently pulled her children aside. A man in a business suit frowned and quickly looked down at his phone. No one stepped forward. No one intervened. There was no supervisor, no second opinion, just Hank and Mercer, one man trying to hold on to his dignity, the other enjoying the authority to strip it away. Mercer jabbed a finger toward a small cubicle behind a curtain. You can either take it off in there, or you're not getting on that plane. Your choice. It wasn't about safety anymore, or security protocols. This was about humiliation, making an example out of someone. Hank stood silent for a moment, weighing it all, then gave a single nod. He picked up his bag and began walking toward the cubicle. His gait was uneven, unsteady. The leg he was being forced to remove had once carried him out of a kill zone. It had climbed out of burning wreckage. Now it was being treated like a weapon. He didn't speak, but inside something shifted. Something cold and old stirred within him. Something forged years ago under foreign skies, when men barked orders and others had to decide what kind of man they wanted to be. Inside the cramped cubicle, Hank lowered himself slowly onto the hard plastic chair. The corners of the room pressed in around him, narrow and confining. A flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting an impersonal glare over whitewashed walls. He looked down at his prosthetic leg. Once it had been a symbol of everything he'd endured, everything he'd conquered. Now it felt like something he had to apologize for, defend, strip away. In shame. He steadied his breath. Years of military discipline kept him from snapping, but his patience was beginning to crack at the edges. From outside the curtain, Mercer's voice barked again, sharp with impatience now. You done yet, sir? We don't have all day. Hank didn't respond right away. His hand came to rest on the synthetic calf of his leg, fingers tracing its smooth carbon surface. He could feel every nick, every scratch, each one a memory. Mountain hikes, security lines, concrete trails. This wasn't just a machine. It was him now. It was the closest thing he had to the flesh and bone he'd lost the day the condom hit an IED outside Bakuba. For a moment, he closed his eyes. He could smell the scorched rubber, see the haze of smoke in the Iraqi sun, hear the panicked shouts of younger soldiers, green, scared, calling for help. Come with us. Her words cut through the tension like a scalpel, precise and final. Hank stood, steadying himself, not with apology, but with quiet control. His prosthetic, the very subject of humiliation just moments ago, locked into place with a metallic click. The agents on either side of her shifted slightly, their posture making it clear this wasn't a request. Carlson's eyes didn't waver as she gestured toward the hallway beyond the checkpoint. We'll escort you to the secure lounge. Your flight will be held until you are ready to board. Any issues with the airline have already been resolved. He moved forward without hesitation, each step a slow reclaiming of dignity. As they walked, the silence parted around them. People watched, some with curiosity, others with quiet recognition. Travelers lowered their phones, TSA agents stood still, no one moved to interfere. The presence of the Department of Defense in a place like this wasn't just unusual, it was seismic. And Hank, still bleeding internally from the sting of public shame, didn't shrink from it. He walked straight through the center of the storm, flanked by authority, buoyed by something far more powerful than uniform or title, validation. They reached the private corridor, and the door closed behind them with a soft but definitive thud. Carlson stopped and turned. On behalf of the Department of Defense, Sergeant Major, I offer our sincerest apology. That never should have happened. He looked at her, exhaustion and gratitude tangled behind his eyes. I've dealt with worse, he said, his voice even. But not like this, not in front of everyone. She nodded, her face composed but human. That's exactly why we intervened. A silence passed between them. Not awkward, not empty, but full. She handed him a bottle of water. Your file flagged the moment your call went through. Code red is rarely used, but in this case fully warranted. The incident is already under review. The agents involved will be removed from frontline duty, effective immediately. Hank took the bottle, nodding once. I wasn't trying to start a fire. You didn't, she said. You just stopped pretending it wasn't already burning. He let out a quiet breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh, but close. Behind him, one of the security men answered a radio transmission, murmuring into his mic. Another agent entered, nodding discreetly toward Carlson. She turned back to Hank. Your family's been contacted. We've arranged for a representative to meet you at Walter Reed when you land. You'll have a full escort until then. We're not letting this happen again. Not to you, not to anyone. Hank didn't reply right away. He just stared at her, and for a moment, she thought he might cry. But he didn't. He blinked once, slowly. You say that like you mean it, he said. I do. Then finally he nodded. Outside, the airport returned to its normal rhythm, but not quite the same. Something had shifted, even if only slightly. Somewhere beyond the terminals and security lines, a quiet line had been drawn. And for the first time in a long time, Hank didn't feel like he was on the wrong side of it. Come with me. General Beckett is here and wishes to speak with you directly. Hank hesitated. That name, he knew it. General James Beckett, the Secretary of Defense, former commander of JSOC, a man whose name carried a certain gravity in military circles, the kind that drew attention and respect long before he entered a room. And now he was here at a TSA checkpoint, asking to speak with him. Hank followed Carlson out of the cubicle, a quiet current of tension tugging at his chest. The terminal still hadn't resumed movement. Monitors were frozen, conveyor belts idle. No one dared step forward. No bags rolled along the track. TSA agents stood stiffly in place, avoiding eye contact, unsure if they should proceed or retreat. At the center of it all, near the main scanning area, stood a tall figure whose mere presence seemed to pull the air taut. Late 60s, dressed in full uniform, rows of commendation ribbons neatly displayed on his chest. His posture was disciplined but unforced, and his eyes, sharp, unwavering, took in everything at once. General Beckett, flanked by Pentagon security officers, senior aides, and one severe-faced official from Homeland Security, he looked like the embodiment of order and consequence. Mercer stood off to one side, visibly rattled, hands twitching slightly. Supervisor Haney stood ramrod straight, her lips thin, her eyes flicking between Beckett and her subordinate like a child caught mid-lie. Beckett said nothing at first. He scanned the entire checkpoint slowly, his gaze landing momentarily on each person. There was no need to raise his voice. His silence commanded enough. Then his eyes found Hank, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps. Respect. Command Sergeant Major Brody, Beckett said, stepping forward, hand extended. You should never have had to call us. Hank took the hand, grip firm. Didn't think anyone would. Beckett nodded, then turned away from Hank and faced Mercer and Haney squarely. His voice, when it came, cut through the air with surgical precision, clear, calm, but hard enough to crack steel. Let me be absolutely clear, he began. Ordering a decorated combat veteran to remove a medically necessary prosthetic in public, in violation of agency protocol, against medical advice, and with complete disregard for basic human dignity, is not just a training failure. It is an insult to every man and woman who has ever bled for this country. The words hit the terminal like a shockwave. Mercer looked like he wanted to shrink into the floor. Beckett's hand rose slightly, pointing directly at him. Agent Mercer, I've read your incident report. You ignored a documented medical exemption. You disrespected this man's service. You bypassed every alternative screening method available, all of which were designed to treat cases like his with care and respect. Do you deny any of this? Mercer stammered, voice cracking. Sir, I thought the device needed clearance. And you were wrong, Detective. Beckett snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. You were wrong, and your smug little power trip ends now. He turned sharply to Haney. Supervisor Haney, you authorized that decision. Did you speak to Sergeant Major Brody personally? Did you verify his documentation? Check his service record? Or did you simply nod along with whatever your junior agent claimed? Haney barely whispered, "No, sir." Beckett's voice dropped to a low, frozen timbre. "You violated the Americans with Disabilities Act, TSA policy, and the core principles of human decency. Effective immediately, this checkpoint is suspended. All screening operations will be rerouted. You are both relieved of duty pending formal investigation." Gasps echoed from the nearby passengers. Dozens of phones had already been raised, cameras rolling. The terminal wasn't just watching, they were bearing witness. Beckett turned toward the crowd. He wasn't addressing Mercer or Haney Budge anymore. He was speaking to everyone, and everyone was listening. "Let it be understood," he said firmly, "no veteran will be subjected to humiliation by incompetence. Not here, not in this country, not while I hold this office." And with those words, the terminal transformed. No longer just a place of security lines and boarding announcements, it became the stage for a reckoning. Silence still lingered, but now it was charged with meaning. No bins clattered, no belts moved, no boarding passes beeped. The checkpoint had become something else, an arena where accountability had taken center stage. General Beckett remained in the middle of it all, not behind a podium, not flanked by a press team, but grounded and immovable at the heart of the commotion. Travelers began inching closer to the ropes, drawn in by the quiet power of the moment. Brows furrowed, some whispering, others simply watching with a kind of reverent stillness. The gravity in Beckett's voice never changed, but each word rolled out like distant thunder. "I want every traveler in this terminal, every American watching this, and every agency paying attention to understand the following, clearly and permanently." He paused, turning slightly to gesture toward Hank, who stood silently to his right, upright but humbled by the weight of the moment. "Prosthetics are not threats. They are not suspicious items. They are the physical remnants of sacrifice." His voice held firm, but his tone softened just slightly with the next words. This man lost his leg defending this nation in combat, and he had earned respect, more than most ever would, but instead, he was treated like a liability. The recognition he deserved was replaced by wariness, the kind of quiet distrust that speaks louder than words. Suspicion, not gratitude, was what greeted him. But that ended here, and it ended now. A hush settled over the terminal, but something stirred beneath the silence. Emotion rippled quietly across the gathered crowd. A few people began nodding slowly, solemnly. Others wiped at their eyes. Even a young TSA agent, stationed just a lane over, lowered his gaze, the weight of shame settling visibly on his shoulders. General Beckett's voice didn't waver. Calm but resolute, it cut through the silence like a bell. "Effective immediately, he said. I'm implementing a full retraining initiative across all TSA facilities. Every single one." He paused just long enough to let the words land. Mandatory instruction on ADA compliance, on how to interact across agencies with wounded veterans, and most importantly, on the human dignity owed to those who have sacrificed for this nation. He glanced across the room, steel in his tone. If that means pulling agents off duty for days to get this right, so be it. If it means removing leadership that fails to uphold these standards, then that's what will happen, because we are not a country that turns its face from disrespect, not when it's aimed at those in uniform, whether that's on a battlefield or at a security checkpoint. Still no one moved. But now the silence carried weight. It buzzed with agreement, with shared conviction. An invisible thread of unity passed through them all. Then Beckett turned to Hank. His voice softened only slightly. "Sergeant Major Brody, I can't take back what happened this morning. I can't undo that injustice. But I won't let it rob you of your voice today." He gestured toward the tarmac outside. "My aircraft is ready. You'll be flying to Washington, D.C. with me, as my guest." Hank blinked. He looked caught off guard, as if unsure he'd heard correctly. "General, that's not necessary." "Yes," Beckett cut in, firm but gentle. "It is." He took a step closer. "You've already done more for this country than most ever will. The least we can do is make sure you get to Walter Reed the way you deserve. not walking alone down some crowded jetway, but with the full respect of this nation behind you. There was a beat of stillness, and then a few people clapped. Not loud, not wild, but sincere. Then more joined in. It spread through the terminal like a slow tide, a quiet standing ovation. Not the noise of celebration, but the solemn rhythm of respect. Hank looked around, humbled. This moment wasn't about pride. It wasn't even about vindication. It was about something deeper, about finally being seen, about being valued. General Beckett nodded to his team. "Escort Sergeant Major Brody through," he instructed. "We've got a plane to catch." As the two men turned and began walking toward the exit, military aid is falling into step beside them. Beckett turned once more to face the crowd. "If you ever witness a veteran being disrespected," he said, voice unwavering, "don't just stand by. Speak up, step in. We owe them far more than our silence." And with that, they walked on, leaving behind not just a terminal, but a moment that had changed the atmosphere itself. This place, this crowd, would never be quite the same again. Not just in policy, but in principle. Minutes later, near the back of the terminal, a small voice rose. A child tugged gently on his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Who was that man?" The woman's eyes shimmered. Her voice came quiet but sure. "That," she said, "was a real leader." By the time Harold Hank Brody touched down in Washington, D.C., the world already knew what had happened. Someone in the terminal had filmed the entire exchange, from General Beckett's sudden arrival to his powerful statement before the crowd. The clip, just under 6 minutes long, was shaky and unedited, but it didn't matter. It struck something raw and true. By noon, it had spread like wildfire. Veteran humiliated at TSA checkpoint. Secretary of Defense shuts it down. General Beckett confronts TSA in fiery airport speech. Prosthetic treated like weapon, real hero treated like threat. Major networks looped the footage across every time zone. CNN, Fox News, NBC, even late-night hosts opened their shows with it. The video had all the elements of a reckoning: injustice, authority, a public reversal, and, at its center, a soldier finally defended when it mattered most. Social media erupted. Hashtags trended for days. #honor Hank, #prosthetics are not threats, #vet dignity now. And then the stories poured in. Thousands of veterans began sharing their own experiences. Their silence broke. Accounts of prosthetics swabbed aggressively, of medals questioned, of service animals denied entry. They came from every war, every era. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, even those who had served during peacetime. The stories flooded timelines, comment sections, inboxes. A retired Marine tweeted, "Hank Brody stood up for all of us who stayed quiet too long. That man isn't just a hero, he's a reminder." Another post read, "We trained to serve with honor. We didn't train to be treated like criminals when we came home." The backlash was swift, and the message was clear. Within 24 hours, the TSA released a rare, formal national apology. The tone was contrite. They didn't try to explain it away. They didn't minimize what happened. For once, they simply said, "We were wrong," almost pleading. "We deeply regret the treatment of Command Sergeant Major Harold Brody and acknowledge that our procedures failed to uphold the dignity and respect that wounded veterans are rightfully owed." The words came from a high-ranking spokesperson, but they sounded like too little, too late. Promises followed: swift reforms, mandatory retraining for every screening agent across the country, but they weren't enough. Not for the veteran community, not for the public. Veterans organizations wasted no time. The American Legion, Wounded Warrior Project, Disabled American Veterans. Each group mobilized with swift, fierce clarity, demanding more than just public apologies. They wanted change. They demanded accountability. Capitol Hill began to stir. The attention of key lawmakers had been captured, and by the end of the week, a bipartisan committee announced the launch of a formal congressional hearing under the title Dignity in Transit. The aim, to ensure that veterans and disabled travelers receive the basic human decency they deserved while passing through TSA checkpoints. The committee sent out formal requests for testimony from top TSA officials, from leaders of military advocacy groups, and most notably from Hank Brody himself. 2 weeks later, when Hank entered the Senate hearing room, he did so without any entourage, media handler, or theatrics. No uniform, no medals. Just a modest suit, a quiet demeanor, and a small pin from his old unit affixed to his lapel. The cameras turned to him, the microphones waited, but Hank wasn't there for attention. "I didn't ask to be treated like a hero," he began in a steady, unembellished tone. "But I didn't deserve to be treated like a threat either." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Veterans carry wounds you can see, and a whole lot you can't. The very least this country can do is meet them with dignity when they pass through its gates." There was no applause, no gasps, just silence. A solemn, collective acknowledgement that truth had just been spoken. His testimony didn't need headlines. It carried more force than any newspaper front page ever could. In the months that followed, real changes began to take root. New TSA protocols were implemented across the country. Private screening rooms for prosthetic inspections became mandatory. Screening agents were required to undergo extensive retraining, this time with an emphasis on ADA compliance and trauma-informed care. Veteran liaison officers were appointed at major airports, trained to support and advocate for travelers like Hank. What had started as one man's quiet humiliation in an airport screening area had ignited something far larger. A conversation that was long overdue, a movement toward empathy, a national reckoning with how the country treats those who've already sacrificed more than enough. Through it all, Hank Brody stayed the same. Quiet, grounded, uninterested in fame. He had entered that airport just another traveler, just a man trying to get home. But when he walked out, he'd become something else entirely. Not a symbol of outrage, but a figure of earned, unshakable dignity. Now, the auditorium at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center was filled to its walls. Not a single seat was empty. Doctors in lab coats sat beside researchers in tailored suits. Uniformed service members and veterans from nearly every conflict in recent memory sat shoulder to shoulder, their attention fixed on the stage. There, at the center of it all, stood a polished wooden podium bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. On either side, flags stood proudly. Behind the podium, a large screen displayed the theme of the event: Resilience through Innovation, the future of prosthetics. Harold Hank Brody had been on the schedule for weeks. But after what happened at the airport, after the hearing, after his words echoed across the country, his presence on stage took on a deeper significance. He wasn't just delivering a keynote. He had become the face of what it meant to reclaim dignity, through adversity, through silence, through action. Still, he entered the stage the way he always had, without spectacle. No spotlight, no triumphant music. Just the measured tap of his dress shoes against the hardwood floor. One made of polished leather, the other of carbon fiber. At the microphone, he paused and scanned the audience. Then he spoke. "When I first stood on one leg beside the remains of the other," he said plainly, "I thought my life was over." He didn't flinch, not just because of the pain, but because I didn't know what kind of man I'd be if I couldn't walk the way I used to. The room was silent. No one moved. "The thing about a prosthetic limb," he continued, "is that it doesn't replace who you were. It helps carry who you are, forward." He spoke of his recovery, the agony of phantom pain, the frustration of relearning how to walk, the quiet victories in moments no one saw. He spoke about the engineers who painstakingly customized his new leg, about the nurses who stood beside him when he nearly gave up, about the long stretches of silence where pride and shame collided. He talked about the unspoken battlefield that awaited many wounded veterans once they returned, not in foreign lands but in airports, job interviews, and grocery store aisles. A battlefield of stares, discomfort, and subtle prejudice. And then he turned. "I thought I'd come here today to talk about technology," he said, nodding toward the screen, prepared with diagrams of limb innovations. "But after this week, I realized what we need more than innovation is recognition." A ripple of murmurs stirred across the room. No one looked away. A prosthetic limb isn't something to be feared or pitied. It isn't a threat, and it isn't a burden. It's a chapter, one carved out through sacrifice, forged in resilience, and sealed through the act of service. When he spoke those words, Hank didn't raise his voice or let it tremble with anger. He paused, inhaled slowly, and then delivered the closing line with quiet, resolute certainty. We don't wear these limbs to hide. We wear them to remember. For a long second, the auditorium was frozen in silence. Then came the applause. It started soft, polite even, but then it built, wave after wave rising like a tide. Uniformed men and women stood first, then the doctors, then visitors, each adding their voice to a unified ovation. It wasn't just noise, it was reverence. Some people wiped their eyes. Others simply stood with their hands clasped, heads slightly bowed. From off stage, General Beckett stood watching. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The message had landed, loud and clear, and its echo would stretch far beyond the walls of Walter Reed. Later that day, journalists would plaster Hank's final words across headlines, social media feeds, and talk shows. But for the people in that room, it wasn't a quote to be shared or a soundbite to be clipped. It was truth, etched into titanium and carbon fiber, but also into hearts worn raw by war, by loss, and by the strength it takes to carry on. It was marked by honor. It was defined by pain. But most of all, it was embodied in one man who arrived broken and walked away whole. That same morning, hundreds of miles away, dawn spread a soft orange glow across the mountains of Flagstaff as Harold Hank Brody stepped off a small regional plane. He carried a single bag over one shoulder. His gait was firm, if a little measured. The terminal was still, a sharp contrast to the noise and formality of D.C. There were no cameras, no motorcades, no reporters shouting questions. Just home. He moved through the terminal like someone flipping through pages of a familiar book. The little coffee stand, where he always got his black coffee the day after a flight. The rental desk manned by the same tired clerk who never said much but always nodded in recognition. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Near the security checkpoint, now mostly deserted at this hour, stood a lone TSA agent, young, mid-20s at most, clean-cut. The type Hank had seen so many times in his years of service. As Hank approached, the young man straightened his posture instinctively. No alarms rang out, no trays or scanning belts rattled. No words were exchanged, just a moment suspended in time. The agent took a single step forward and raised his hand. Not to question Hank, not to halt him, but to salute. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't for show. It was quiet, honest. The kind of gesture born from understanding, from someone who had likely watched the footage, read the reports, and recognized that the man now walking through his terminal had carried battles across oceans and carried dignity through fire back home. Hank stopped for a beat, offered a small, knowing smile. He didn't return the salute. He was retired now, after all. But he gave a simple nod, a gesture that carried more meaning than 1,000 words. Recognition, respect, brotherhood. Then he moved forward again, back into the rhythm of daily life. No fanfare, no cameras waiting to capture his next step. Just the soft sound of an automatic door opening and the chill of Arizona morning brushing against his skin. But something felt different, lighter, as though the weight he'd carried for so long had eased, even just a little. Maybe because, finally, people were listening. Maybe because that moment of quiet recognition meant something more than all the policies or headlines ever could. Maybe because true change, the kind that lasts, isn't about grand gestures. It's born in moments like that, unspoken, unrehearsed, real. The screen fades to black, and in white, clean lettering, a single line appears. Respect isn't a protocol. It's a choice. In today's rushing, indifferent world, it's far too easy to overlook the quiet ones. The ones who don't ask for recognition, but carry more than most could bear. Hank Brody's story isn't just about a moment at TSA. It's a mirror, held up to remind us what dignity, service, and honor actually mean, in a world that too often forgets the cost of freedom. How many times have we watched someone be mistreated, a veteran, a disabled passenger, an elderly person in need, and said nothing? This story doesn't just ask for our attention, it calls on our courage. It reminds us that respect isn't just about following rules. It lives in our choices. It breathes in how we treat each other, and it begins the moment we decide not to look away. Hank never asked for privileges. What he longed for, what he quietly expected, was simple fairness. Not to be singled out, not to be pitied, not to be applauded, just to be treated like anyone else. That difference between wanting to be seen as special and wanting to be seen as equal is subtle, but it matters deeply, and it's something we'd all do well to carry with us. If you had been standing there in that airport, in that exact moment, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, raised your voice in protest? Would you have taken out your phone and recorded what was happening, unsure if it would matter but hoping it might? Or maybe, like that young TSA agent at the end, you would have simply met Hank's eyes with a quiet, steady nod, a silent acknowledgement, one that said more than words ever could. I see you, I respect you. Stories like this don't just fade away, they linger. They ask something of us. Maybe you're remembering something now, something that happened to you or to someone you love. A moment when dignity was tested, when silence felt heavy and courage looked like a whisper, not a roar. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it stirred something in you, let that feeling live on. Share it, speak about it, carry it into the way you move through the world. We'll be here, bringing more of these moments to light. Real stories that give voice to people who are too often overlooked, unheard. Because like Hank reminded us, you don't need to make a scene to make a stand. Respect doesn't require volume, it only requires choice. Choose it again and again, every day. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and keep listening.